Thank you, Eliane. First of all, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a pleasure to participate in this amazing series. I think you guys are doing a great job leveraging this kind of lockdown situation to make the most out of it and spread science around. So today I'm going to talk about this paper, Privacy Simplification via Random Check-ins. This is on arXiv and was recently accepted at New RIPS. So you can find the arXiv ID here or a link in my personal webpage. This is joint work with a few colleagues at Google, basically Peter Kairos, Brendan Mahan, Om Thacker, and Abradip Thakurta. And the main goal of this work was to try to figure out how we can give strong privacy guarantees in the sense of differential privacy for realistic federated learning protocols. And in the talk, I'll try to explain what are the main blockers to get these sort of guarantees that by now are kind of standard in the centralized setting. And we felt the federated learning setting was lagging a little bit behind. And what we tried to solve this problem and where we got. And yeah, as Aurelian said, I'm happy to take questions along the way. I don't think there's enough slides here for a 1-hour talk, so hopefully we'll have ample time for discussion. So I know everyone here knows about federated learning, but maybe it's good to give a quick recap, especially using this comic strip that you can find in this Federated with Google.com webpage. So the main appeal of federated learning, as everybody here knows, is that it allows us to train models with data that stay on device. And the way to do that is to bring the training to the device, coordinating this with some central server, let models, let clients run a few iterations of your favorite optimization algorithm on the device, and then pull updates from everyone. Once this computation is done, aggregate these updates in the server and continue. So in a bit more detail, usually in the cross-device setting where we have tons of devices that have data available for the task we're interested in, this looks like this. So first of all, there's generally like a server that kind of offers this federated learning service. And within this server, there's, or having access to the server, there's some engineer that is interested in training a machine learning model. And the final goal is to send this model to devices. So this is the server, this is the engineer that interacts with the model, with the server, and they want to train a model that can be shipped to devices to solve some particular task. For example, language prediction, if your mobile phone has some keyboard that can take suggestions from some machine learning model to improve how you type. The way that federated learning solves this issue is by letting the server communicate with a lot of client devices, each of them having a little local data set that is relevant to the task at hand. And in these devices, we're going to run some machine learning engine. Here, there's the TensorFlow logo, for example. And what these little engines are going to do, they're going to receive the parameters of the current model, and they're going to run a few iterations of optimization with the local data. And then every one of these clients will send their updates to the server. This will be aggregated and we'll iterate this over time, like a few times. So in practice, usually the orders of magnitude of these protocols basically use between 100 and 1,000 users per round, sometimes more. And like the number of rounds until convergence of the model is between 100 and 1,000. And here we have to remember that because we are transmitting the models across the network, we cannot, at least so far, train the super large models that people would train in a server, like GPT style models, for example. And typically each of these rounds take 1 to 10 minutes. So this comes with a few limitations. For example, if we have to do 100 to 1,000 rounds and each of them takes 1 to 10 minutes, that means that the clients who are available throughout training might change over time because people turn their phone off, because people are using their phone, and when the phone is being used, it cannot be used for training. Because people go to sleep and put the phone in airplane mode, or for example, they take the phone out of the house and the phone is not charging. So when it's not charging, this is also not advised to spend a lot of energy in training because you drain the battery pretty fast. So that all is to say that federated learning comes with its own set of constraints that are very different from centralized learning. And the purpose of this talk is to look at how this kind of setup affects privacy threats. So when we look at this whole framework, we might ask what private information might an actor learn with access to different parts of the system. And the idea here is basically that because federated learning allows us to train with data on devices, this data can be quite sensitive. It can be like users' pictures or users' text messages, users' emails, things like this. And although there is some privacy benefit in not bringing the data to a centralized place like a server and train the model there, there might still be some very real privacy threats in this whole scheme. So some malicious actor could gain access to this information through several attack vectors. Some of them are involved like compromising the devices or compromising the server or compromising the network. On top of that, we also have like the threats that come from like the interactions between the server and the client. So like the client receives several models during training, and those might reveal things about the data that has been used in previous updates and so on. And on top of that, the final goal is also to deploy this model on other devices. And that means that the final model could also leak information about to these new devices from the devices that the data was trained on. So the purpose of this talk is to analyze this last privacy threat, the one about the deployed model. And the main reason for this is because this is the kind of guarantee that differential privacy provides. And for most of the other problems, we have cryptographic solutions or hardened or security solutions that will prevent some of these issues. But the goal, by definition, is to deploy the model at the end. So this is a very real privacy risk that is by default embedded in this framework. So in a little bit more detail, like this comic strip summarize what I just said. Basically, the idea is that although we will be aggregating updates from many users using cryptography, and probably like nobody will get access to individual updates coming from every user, when users have unique data, this unique data can show in the model. And that's kind of the subject of this very thriving research area of privacy attacks. And this has been shown to be like a very real threat. There are attacks out there that perform membership inference and reconstruction attacks that basically have shown that successfully attackers with enough side knowledge can, given a model, detect whether a certain point was used for training that model. And even in some cases, especially in the case of language models, can try to extract some of this data from the model. So differential privacy will help us protect against this, but we will need to be careful because differential privacy is not a 0 or 1 thing. It's a quantitative guarantee. And what that means is that there's a knob, and this knob will tell us how private the model is. So in this talk, what we're going to try to do is make sure that we can make this knob as small as possible in the sense of giving as much privacy as possible without losing too much accuracy. Because if you're not aware, differential privacy basically works by adding noise, and that typically means that we will be losing some accuracy. Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar with differential privacy, I will try to give a brief recap. So differential privacy is something that has been studied in the literature since 2006, starting with this seminal paper by Dwork et al. And the idea here is very abstract. It's a bit more abstract than what we've been looking at so far. There's a data set that contains data from several individuals, and we are data analysts, so we really want to run like a query on this data set. The query can be something as simple as compute the average salary of all the people in the data set, to something as complicated as train this deep neural network architecture using information from this data set. So differential privacy tries to model how much the output of such query will leak about the individual points in the training data set. And basically it says that the first thing you should do to avoid leakage is make sure that this procedure is randomized. So that means that, for example, instead of releasing a mean, we will release a mean plus noise, or that when we train this deep neural network, instead of using like the standard gradients we get, maybe we'll be adding a little bit of noise to each of the gradients to make sure that the contributions of each individual are kind of masked by the noise, and that limits the influence of any trained data point in the final model in machine learning applications. So how should one think about formalizing this? Well, once we have any randomized algorithms, we can look at the space of outcomes. And basically what we have is a probability distribution over the space of outcomes defined by this algorithm that usually is called the mechanism M. So once we have this, we can consider the following thought experiment. We can consider an alternative world where one of the persons in our data set was replaced by another person, potentially fictitious or another real person. So here is an example where the original data set contained Alice's, Bob, and Carol's data. And then we have this so-called neighboring data set that still contains Alice's and Bob's data, but now Carol's data is replaced with Charles' data. So when we do that, and we run the same algorithm on this new green data set, we get a different distribution over outcomes. So differential privacy, what basically tries to do is control the similarity between these two distributions. And the idea being that when the two distributions are very close, nobody, by getting access to the output of the algorithm, will be able to tell with very high probability whether the data set that was used to produce this output was the one that contained Carol's data or Charles' data. And that will provide privacy to, for example, Carol's data, and by extension to any other person in this data set, because we can do this for any person. So formally, what we say typically is that an algorithm is epsilon delta differentially private if the distribution of the output of MD, in particular, for example, distribution over trained models on a data set D, is nearly the same as MD prime for all pairs of adjacent data sets D and D prime. And this closeness is measured in terms of this formula here that basically says, if I look at the output distribution of the algorithm with input data set D, and I look at all possible sets of output S, I can assign a probability to this output set. And I can also assign a probability to this output set under this alternative world where we have changed one of the training points. And what we want is for these two probabilities to be close, regardless of the change we make to the data set and regardless of this set of possible outcomes as we're looking at. So to make this even more formal, this closeness is measured by two parameters, epsilon and delta. So epsilon appears in a multiplicative way as e to the epsilon in front of the probability that we changed. And then there's a little delta here that allows for example, this epsilon guarantee to be violated with a very small probability. So typically, when we think about these algorithms, we tend to think that delta should be something very small, should be something much smaller than 1 over the size of the data set. So maybe like 1 over n squared if there are n people in the data set, even smaller ideally. And epsilon is the main parameter. So epsilon, we tend to think of it being some constant close to 1 or 2, like definitely in like a 1-digit number. And epsilon is typically the most important of the parameters. Any questions? Okay, I'll assume there are none. So this framework of differential privacy has been instantiated quite successfully in the machine learning world. And by now we have like pretty standard solutions for differentially private centralized learning that basically involve privatizing like standard optimization algorithms like SGD. And this algorithm is typically called DPSGD. And what it does is interacts with the data set to produce a model by doing what SGD would do, but with two main differences. The first one is that whenever we get gradients, say we take a mini batch of data at some iteration, and we want to compute gradients for each of the points in that mini batch, the first thing we're going to do is try to limit the influence of every point on the final gradient by clipping these gradients to a maximum L2 norm, for example. And then we will average these clipped gradients and we will add a little bit of Gaussian noise. So the main point here is that when we do this and we, for example, run the algorithm for T epochs on n data points, we can compute what is the final epsilon, this kind of privacy guarantee for the output of this algorithm. Now, if we do this naively, we will end up with an epsilon that scales like square root number of epochs. This is very bad because we said that we want epsilon to be like a constant between, say, maybe like 1 or 10. That means that the number of epochs we can do is relatively small by at least today's machine learning standards. But this kind of naive approach misses some things that DPSGD or like SGD itself have embedded in it that can give us extra privacy. These things are either the fact that we might be sampling that we're not using every point at every iteration, but that we're actually sampling mini batches every time. So that means that even, for example, if we consider two data sets where we change one person and we sample mini batches from these two data sets, the probability that we pick the point where the data sets differ is very small. It's like size of batch size divided by number of persons. So that means that quite often we will be working with a mini batch that doesn't include this point that increases the privacy leakage, and we should be able to leverage this somehow. This is what in the privacy literature is called amplification by subsampling. Another way that DPSGD introduces additional randomness is instead of sampling, and actually this happens more often in practice, what we do is we shuffle the whole data set at each iteration and then take subsequent mini batches ordered by this shuffling. So this again has the effect that of all these mini batches we'll consider in a single iteration, only one of them will contain the point where the data sets differ, and this should also decrease our privacy leakage. And this is something that has been realized more recently, in particular a couple of years ago. And by now it's kind of standard that amplification by shuffling is also an important primitive in analyzing differentially private algorithms, and in particular SGD. So when we use either of these techniques, roughly up to constants, we get the same sort of amplified privacy certificates that still have the square root t dependence, but now is divided by square root n. And that means that we, for the same privacy cost or like target epsilon, we can do many, many more iterations when we can account for the privacy that comes from sampling or shuffling. So what is the issue when we try to translate these sort of ideas or guarantees to the federated learning setup? Well, the first of all is that clients have limited availability and sometimes not even like overlapping across clients. And the reason for this is because when the server tries to figure out which clients are available to do like one step or one iteration of training, some of them might not be available because they're either not charging, they're not idle, and some of them might be available. But even in this setting, like the server doesn't generally have access to like who is available. The server doesn't even have like a list of like all possible phones that are part of the system and can go one by one querying them and say who's available so that I can do something like shuffle you or sample from you. Usually the way this happens is the clients report to the server and say, hey, I'm available for training, do you need me? So that basically means that these ideas of sampling from like the available population are very tricky to implement. And it's even harder to implement something that says, look, I need all these clients to be available for a whole epoch so that I can shuffle you and then like take your updates in order. This is close to impossible to implement in modern federated learning platforms. And on top of that, this like clashes with other optimizations that people have been developing for federated learning, like load balancing and so on. So that leaves us in a place that if we want to like give privacy guarantees for federated learning, we either use the naive analysis that we know will give us like very large epsilons, or tell us that if we want a small epsilon, we can only do like so many iterations. Or we can try to provide privacy guarantees based on the centralized technology that will be making assumptions that don't hold in practice. So we'll be getting like guarantees that are a bit like that don't really, that they might be morally on the right ballpark, but they are definitely not true in a strict sense of how the algorithms are implemented. So what can we do to solve this issue? This is what we propose to do in this paper. We propose to do a random check-ins protocol where we account for all these limitations, and basically we try to get amplification to work with randomness that only comes from the clients, nothing that is orchestrated by the server. So the key idea here is that basically what we're going to have is we're going to have a bunch of protocol slots, and then clients autonomously on their own will decide which slot or slots they want to contribute to and whether they want to contribute at all. So basically the way the random check-ins protocol works is, first of all, each client by themselves will flip a coin. It's going to be a biased coin. And with some probability, they decide they participate in the protocol. And basically for now, let's think about the protocol as a whole epoch, one epoch of training. So flipping this coin will tell whether the client participates in this epoch or not. And if they decide to participate, then they will roll a die, and they will use this die to decide among their limited availability, which doesn't need to be like the whole time of the protocol. So among all the slots they kind of plan to be available on, which one they're going to contribute, and we're going to limit them to contribute to only one of those. So the idea here is that these two sources of randomness mimic the kind of guarantees or like the kind of techniques that we can use in the centralized setting. So flipping this coin basically will give us sampling style amplification, and rolling a die will give us shuffling style amplification, right? Because both of them will introduce some uncertainty. So flipping the coin will introduce uncertainty on whether I'm participating or not, which is the same thing we're doing with subsampling. And rolling the die will introduce uncertainty on, even if you know that I'm available during this time, in which of these particular slots I'm going to participate, I'm going to randomize that. So I'm going to introduce some uncertainty there. And this is nice because it's compatible with clients having non-overlapping and limited availabilities. But obviously this might not work in practice. So we need to figure out how we implement differentially private SGD in this case, how we give privacy guarantees, and whether we will be able to recover the same type of optimal guarantees that we have in the centralized setting, which is something I realize now I forgot to mention. So I should have mentioned earlier that when we do these amplification style guarantees, either through sampling or shuffling in the centralized setting, the algorithms we get, at least in the convex case, we know that they have like the same utility than optimal protocols would have. So they are matching lower bounds. So we cannot do in general better than what we do in the centralized setting with these amplification techniques.
So Borja, maybe just a question on the previous slide. So this client-side protocol, is it more something you think as a kind of modeling? So flipping this coin is the way you model the fact that maybe all clients might not be available, or is it something that should actually run on available clients and they should run this to decide, or just to disambiguate a bit between what is sort of modeling the situation maybe and what is actual protocol that?
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's also something I should have mentioned. So we, in our analysis, what we assume is that availability of clients is controlled by nature. So nature will decide potentially adversarially who's available and who's not. And the idea is that if very few people are available, this can definitely compromise the utility of the final models, but it shouldn't compromise the privacy. So the randomness that I was alluding to, flipping the coin and rolling the die, is something that the protocol that is run by the clients will do whenever they're available to participate in a certain epoch. Does that clarify your question?
Yeah, it does. Okay, and these slots, they correspond to rounds or epoch, or?
Yeah, so I'm presenting this here a bit more abstractly. If we try to look how we can implement DPSGD in this setup, this will correspond to training slots, which basically mean iterations of SGD. And for simplicity, what we're going to assume is that all these, like if I have M slots, this corresponds to what I want to call an epoch, but it doesn't even need to be an epoch in the sense of like using every client's data once.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks.
Cool. So, okay, so in a bit more detail, how do we instantiate DPSGD in this setup? So basically what we're going to have is we're going to have N clients and we're going to have M slots. And here for simplicity, and really in the paper we relax that, but in the talk I don't want to get into these details. Here, this N is kind of like the clients that are going to be made available by nature in this process, in the running of one epoch. But as you will see later, our privacy guarantees don't depend on N. So the server doesn't know what N is. N is just this number of available clients that nature controls, if that makes sense. Okay, so then basically the way we can instantiate DPSGD in this setup, we have two variants. So also for the purpose of the talk, I'm just gonna go in detail on one variant, and then I'll briefly mention what happens in the other variant, but it's a bit more technical, so I won't go that much into details there. So for the variant one, what basically happens is at each of these training times that corresponds to the slots, we have a model that has been trained so far. Let's call this theta I if we're in step I. And what we're going to do at this step is we know that there's a number of clients, the ones that are highlighted here, that have checked in to be available at time I. So what the protocol will do is the protocol has this list, like the server has a list of clients that have checked in at time I. And what it does is it picks one from this listed random. It sends them the current parameters of the model and asks for an update. And the update that we will be getting will be the client. So suppose that we select client J that was available or that checked in at time I. So then what will happen is client J will get the parameters at time I, theta I. It has its data DJ, and DJ can be like a single data point or can be a data set, it's a bit abstract at this point. And what we do is we compute the gradient of the loss at theta I with at DJ and theta I. And what we're going to do is we're going to privatize this gradient in the same way we would do in DPSGD. So we will compute this gradient, we will clip it, we will add some Gaussian noise to it. And that will give us like some privacy guarantees. And we will submit this to the server, who will combine theta I and the update using SGD or something with momentum, or like whichever optimization algorithm that you can make work with the DPSGD framework will also work here, to obtain the parameters of the next iteration. And we will keep going. Now, the main thing about this variant is that it's kind of like relatively easy to analyze and has some advantages from the privacy side, but from the utility side, you will be paying a little bit by this fact that you will be discarding clients, because from all the clients that have checked in at time I, we will only be taking one. Instead, what we could do is we could request updates from all the clients that are available or checked in at time I, and average those updates. These should be better in practice, but the privacy analysis of this setup is slightly more intricate. So I won't mention many more things about variant 2, but I refer you to the paper where we talk about this and the differences between the two in more detail. Okay, I realize there's a question here. I don't know how long this has been there.
I think it's just come up. I can try to unmute the Shahab.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much. So a quick question. The client J receives theta I, right? Is it the noisy version of theta I, or is just, you know, the non-noisy version?
So yeah, that's a good question. Basically what happens is that we start with some theta 0. And every time, so that's the initial model. And every time we update it, the updates themselves come with noise because they're based on noisy gradients. So theta I is kind of already private. We don't need to add it more noise to send it to J. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Okay, and yeah, when we talk about the privacy guarantees, we will see that actually, and this is something that is also standard in the centralized setting, the privacy guarantees hold for all the intermediate models at the same time. Although we want to release like a final model, we get kind of for free guarantees for all the intermediate models. So it's fine to send theta I to client J at the middle of training. Okay.
Sorry, just another quick question. So at time 1, so theta 1 does not really have any noise on it, right? So does that reveal any privacy, any private information?
No, if we think that this is like, if we are at the start of training, we usually initialize the model randomly. So theta 0 or theta 1 will not have like, we don't need to privatize it because it hasn't seen any data yet.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
And if we're doing this in subsequent like epochs, then the guarantees that come from the previous epoch already apply. Okay, so very briefly, what are the advantages of this setup? The first of all is the efficiency. So the server doesn't need to like send randomness to people in a secret way or anything like this. Like the randomness is generated by the clients, and that is something that we can do very efficiently. In terms of the privacy guarantees, there's a combination between sampling and shuffling to get amplification. And we show that actually using this combination, we can recover the similar rates of amplification that we would get in the centralized setting. But so that is with tuning parameters that are like dependent on the population. But even if we don't know the population, we can still get precise and 100% mathematically valid privacy guarantees without, that will depend on the parameters of the protocol, but don't need to depend on the size of the population. On top of that, this technique is pretty flexible because it trades-offs privacy and utility using the limited availability of the client. So if more clients are available, so more or less availability of clients will not change like the privacy, but it will like improve the utility. So like it kind of decouples a little bit these two issues. And on top of that, like there's minimal server orchestration. So the only thing the server needs to do is keep a list of checked-in clients at each time step and then be able to access one or all the checked-in clients depending on which variant you're using at each time step. In terms of the privacy guarantees, obviously, like we need some assumptions to make this work. So the first assumption that we're going to make is that the randomness in the client remains private. So clients don't go around saying, hey, I checked in at slot 25. That's cool. That will break your privacy. So don't do that. Second, the clients are going to be curious but honest, or honest but curious, which means that they're going to follow the protocol. If they get intermediate updates, they might try to like break the privacy in those intermediate updates, but they're not going to try to send garbage or to check in more than one slot or things like this. The fourth one is that communications cannot be eavesdropped or detected. This is kind of a strong assumption. But it's kind of necessary for these kind of things to work because first, like if dropped, if I am able to intercept the update that a client is sending, then I will get, like this client still gets a little bit of privacy, but only the privacy corresponding to the noise that was added to their own gradient. And that's going to be much less than the privacy we're going to give for the final model. And on top of that, if the communication is detected in the sense that like somebody by snooping the network figures out that this is the client that was selected to participate in a certain slot, then this amplification that comes, at least the one that comes from shuffling, will disappear because the uncertainty of where the client sent their update is not going to be there anymore. The reason why we think this is somewhat reasonable is because like phones are communicating with servers all the time, and like if the models are small enough, maybe like the chances of like picking this up and like picking it up at the particular time that the client is sending the update is going to be tricky. But it's definitely an assumption that we would like to relax, but we just don't know how at the moment. So, and yeah.
Yeah, Borja, maybe just a quick question. So this kind of assuming, at least from the perspective of the server, like anonymous communications, you know, from clients, meaning that when someone sends an update, you cannot really link that to a particular phone, maybe, or?
That is not necessary for giving privacy guarantees on the final model or the sequence of models. So you have to think here of the server as, for example, the shuffler in a shuffle protocol, right? So in the differentially private shuffle model, if you have a shuffler, the shuffler knows who the updates are coming from, but after the shuffler, this information is lost. So what we're assuming here, like the server will know who's participating. So we're not worried about the guarantees that you get if you are able to snoop what happens inside the server, but rather what is published outside the server.
I see. So your guarantees are mostly targeting publishing the final model, not so much with respect to the server itself.
Exactly. Yes. But with the additional benefit that the privacy holds for all intermediate models, as I said, and which is also something standard in
right.
the centralized analysis. Okay, so how do these guarantees look like? Here's the main formulas for the variant 1. As I said, this is the easy case. Variant 2 is a bit more tricky, and we also have some variant 3 where we do an analysis where clients are not available throughout the whole epoch. So we can deal with epochs where different availabilities for clients, but these two are a bit more technical. So, I mean, if you're interested, you can look them up in the paper. For variant 1, which we remember is the one where among all the checked-in clients at a given time step, we'll just pick one. the guarantees that we get is that with n training slots, check-in probability P0, and this local randomizer satisfying some privacy guarantees, and then we have two guarantees. So this intermediate local randomizer, which is what we do by clipping the gradient and adding noise in a sense, if it satisfies pure DP, that is epsilon 0 DP, then the final guarantees that we will get will be roughly, and this is just the epsilon, the delta, like I'm not gonna explain the details, is P0 times something that should be like epsilon 0 if epsilon 0 is small, times square root of e to the epsilon 0 divided by n. So the first thing to observe here is that this only depends on parameters that are kind of publicly available, which is the privacy of the local randomizer, the number of slots, and the P0. It doesn't depend on the size of the population or number of available people. If we move to the setup that we really would like to have, which is when the local randomizer doesn't satisfy pure DP, but satisfies approximate DP, so it's epsilon 0 delta 0 DP, we lose a little bit in the constants, which is quite unfortunate. But like, I think there's some work by another group that is trying to solve this. We can talk about this later if you're interested. But basically, we lose a factor of 8 in the epsilon 0 when we're dealing with, say, things like Gaussian noise. Now, these are the privacy guarantees. And in terms of utility guarantees, obviously, like if we're doing this in a non-convex setting, we don't know much. But if we're in the convex setting, we can prove things. So if, for example, we assume that the loss is L-Lipschitz and convex, the space, and we're doing some kind of projected gradient descent, so the parameter space has dimension d and radius r, so that the parameters don't go outside the ball of radius r. Then if the data that the clients have is IID from some distribution d, then what we can say is that the model after m iterations, if we look at the expected loss under the distribution and we take expectation over the parameters that are returned by our protocol, and we compare that with like the optimal expected loss under the distribution, then this goes down like 1 over square root m. And all these other things here are kind of standard. Sigma is, here I'm assuming that I'm adding Gaussian noise with variance sigma, and we could like convert this into some sigma into some epsilon if we want it using this formula, but just gets a bit tricky. So, so this part, like the radius, the square root of dimension times variance plus Lipschitz constant square divided by square root m, this is kind of standard in the DPSGD literature in the convex case. And here we just have this additional little term that models this annoying fact that the way I instantiated the protocol, there might be iterations at which nobody has checked in. And the question is, what should we do in that case? This is a bit tricky because if we don't do anything when nobody has checked in, like somebody that is looking at these outputs of the models will detect that 2 consecutive models are the same. And that will break the privacy of like this uncertainty coming from where people contributed, because you will say, oh, I know for sure that the person I'm trying to attack did not contribute to this log because the models are exactly the same. Well, I mean, this could happen by chance, just by randomness, but the probability of that is very small. And basically what happens, what we do in the protocol is if nobody checked in that slot, we will just add some additional noise into the model. So we'll take the gradient with respect to like some fictitious data point that might be all zeros, and we'll add that to the gradient. And that is gonna harm our utility a little bit, and this is where this term comes from. So this term, if you analyze it, you'll see that it's kind of roughly the number of slots at which nobody participated. Any question about this slide?
Maybe just a quick thing, just to put this into perspective, could you give the order maybe quickly, maybe fixing the privacy guarantee and telling us what would change in the utility guarantee if you consider just LGP, for instance, or the other way around as you prefer, but to give an idea of the order of magnitude, I guess, of gain compared to like a naive naive approach who would only rely on the LGP?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can do that out of the top of my head, sorry. We have some discussions about this in the paper, but because this formula is a bit simplified with the big O. Yeah, I don't think this is the best place to do that. I can later point you to the place in the paper where this is done.
All right, never mind.
So, yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so we have 9 minutes left, so maybe we have time to briefly go over the proof, or like a sketch of the proof of this analysis, which I think is kind of a little bit illuminating if you read these kind of things. And somebody wise at some point said that every talk should have a proof and a joke. And yeah, I don't think I have a joke, but I have a proof. So how do we analyze this privacy guarantee for variant 1? So we have these M training slots, and that means that we're going to produce like M models, theta 1 to theta M. And we want to analyze the privacy of releasing all these models. Now, what we're going to assume is that we have a data set that is the real one, and a data set that is the fake one where one person changed their data. And because the protocol is kind of symmetric, we can assume that the person that changed their data is the first one. Now, what will happen as we go through the protocol is that we can think essentially that there's going to be like M data sets that contain the people who checked in at each of these M time slots. And theta I is going to be like a private function. So will be the result of applying a mechanism on the I that is adaptively selected based on the previous outputs of the protocol. And the key observation, or the first observation that we make here is, and I'm also going to do the analysis just in the epsilon 0 DP case, is that if I fix this data set, then theta I is an epsilon 0 DP function of the data set DI. Next, what we can do is, because the individuals 2 to n don't change in both protocols, what we're going to do is get the randomness out of the way and basically assume that whichever place these 2 up to n users check in one protocol is the same in the other protocol. And that kind of generates these data sets, except that one of them is going to have the point that comes from the person 1. And the adversary's prior here is that this person that differs in both data sets, in like the big data sets, will end up in each of these data sets with probability 1 over m. That's just by definition of how we're doing the random check-ins. And I'm ignoring for now the probability P0 of not checking in. We'll take this into account later. So the key observation here, which is an observation that also occurs when you're trying to analyze amplification by shuffling, is that this prior is very similar to the posterior probability of this person 1 contributing to a data set DI given the previous outputs. So more technically, what we can say is that condition on the outputs up to step I minus 1, the probability that the client I adds their data to data set DI is at most e to the epsilon 0 divided by m, right? So the prior was 1 over m. Now, if I tell you the outputs of the first I minus 1 iterations, this probability at most increases to e to the epsilon 0 divided by m. And this exploits the fact that these outputs are differentially private. And the intuition here is that these previous outputs reveal very little about whether, not because they're private, they reveal very little whether somebody was already used in the previous iterations or not. So once we have this claim, what we can do is use the same analysis that comes from amplification by shuffling that show that at every step, this theta I satisfies e to the epsilon 0 times e to the epsilon 0 minus 1 divided by m differential privacy. So now we have a privacy guarantee for each of the individual outputs, and we're almost done. All we need to do now is say, okay, because I'm going to release all these outputs, all I need to do is apply like the typical composition analysis on differential privacy. And basically what that means is because we have m steps, roughly by advanced composition, this privacy guarantee gets multiplied by square root m. And that means that the final output of like theta 1 up to theta m, if I reveal this, what I'm getting is something that is e to the epsilon 0 times e to the epsilon 0 minus 1 divided by square root m dp. Even if now I add this probability that clients don't participate, what happens is that this is just another instance of amplification by sampling. That basically means that I just need to plug another P0 in front of this guarantee. So this is how roughly the proof works. I skipped a lot of details, and you will notice that this e to the epsilon 0 in the previous slide was inside the square root. So to get that, you need to do a little bit more work. But the scheme is roughly the same. And I think this is quite neat because it shows like how shuffling and composition play together in the proof. Okay, so to sum up.
Borja,
yeah.
Sorry, maybe we had some additional questions that you didn't see before. Maybe it was on the slide before that. Just maybe you can clarify what was delta and delta prime.
Yes.
Confusion about that.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so the final privacy guarantees, they have an epsilon and delta. And here I've given you the epsilon. The delta, if the mechanism is pure, satisfies pure DP, this delta is equal to delta prime. Now, if the mechanism satisfies only approximate differential privacy, then the delta prime will be delta plus delta 0 times something. And this something is going to be something like m times e to the epsilon minus 1. So your delta gets blown up a little bit when the mechanism is only epsilon 0 delta 0 dp. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I should. Okay, so people can, yeah, apparently it does.
Cool. Okay, yeah, getting to my last slide. Basically what we have shown is that federated learning can benefit from strong differential privacy guarantees, but the centralized analysis is not easy to generalize. So to do that, we had to introduce these random check-in protocols that uses privacy simplification only using client-side randomness. It requires minimal server-side orchestration and knowledge of the population. And it's based on combining the ideas that work in the centralized setting, namely amplification by sampling and amplification by shuffling. If you're interested, I suggest you go to the paper. What you will find there are 3 variants of the protocol. Variant 1, which is the one we discussed so far, and basically this one is good for when the population is much larger than the capacity of the server to process updates. Variant 2, which is the one where at each time step we aggregate the data from all the people who checked in at that step. This variant is good when the population is of the order of the server capacity to process updates. And then we have another analysis when clients are available in different, have different availability windows during the course of one epoch. We have a privacy analysis for each of those protocols and a utility analysis in the convex case for each of these protocols. And on top of that, we show that actually when you do a right choice of hyperparameters like learning rate and so on, we can recover the same population risk guarantees than SGD in the centralized setting, which are known to be optimal. And on top of that, something I didn't mention, which is that out of our analysis actually comes an improvement of the standard amplification by shuffling, which if you're into these kind of things might also be of independent interest. So thank you, that's all. And I'm sorry it took a bit more time than I was expecting.
Thanks a lot for the talk. I think it was also quite good to have these preliminaries on GP and so on, because I think not everybody in the audience is super familiar with differential privacy, for instance. Okay, is there any additional questions? Yes, so I can try to unmute Anupam.
Hi, so I'm interested if the code has been made available for this.
No, but not because we don't want to, just because there's no code. This is mostly a theory paper at the moment. So we've been like implementing these things and playing with them, but that's a whole other story. So the paper, as I was talking so far, is only has like theoretical results.
Ah, I see. Okay.
Okay, there was another question about, can you send the presentation, please? So this is usually what we do, right? Okay, Samuel is also available. So we put that available on the Flow website, also the video of the talk, actually, so you can watch it again later. Okay, we have another question by Shahab. Let me mute him.
Thank you so much, Borja. It was a very, very interesting talk. So I have a kind of high-level question. If you only care about privacy of the last model, theta m, can you get, the same result by applying, privacy amplification by iteration, Feldman et al., and, when you do the subsampling without replacement?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think it might be possible to combine these different analyses and do something like privacy amplification by iteration. One of the issues we would have here is that, I mean, in the centralized setting, like privacy amplification by iteration is very nice. And it gives you privacy for the last iterate, although like it gives you different privacy guarantees depending on where in which iteration your data has been used. So it doesn't give the same privacy guarantees to everyone. But something a bit more troubling in this application is that here we must really send intermediate models to clients for them to perform their updates. So it's, although we could try to give this sort of guarantees for the final model, then the privacy model would have two sorts of, like, we need two sorts of guarantees, like the guarantees that like people get against adversaries that kind of can participate in the protocol and observe intermediate models would be different from the guarantees you would get against adversaries that just like are in this population of phones that is going to receive the final model. So yeah, there would be this different mismatch, or this like two sorts of two-tier privacy guarantees. But technically, I think this might be possible, yes. Also, I should probably mention for people in the audience who are not aware, the privacy simplification by iteration also only gives you privacy for convex optimization. So this would be another limitation of the setup.
So Borja, don't you have already a bit these two types of privacy guarantee, one for the final model and one maybe kind of for the server? For the server, yes. Here we don't analyze like the privacy that the server gets. The server, like if you're able to compromise the server, then you get like the local privacy that you get from just your local randomizer, nothing more. But everybody else that is participating in the protocol gets this, like gets the same information as the one, well, roughly, or like at least like the bounds that we give are the same whether you're participating in the protocol or you're getting them all at the end. I see. Do we have any other questions? So maybe I have one still following up a bit on that. So I was wondering also whether, okay, if you do something without this random check-in, maybe you just assume at each time step there is a bunch of clients that are available and they participate, but they would participate by sending their input to a secure shuffler, which would then only reveal, okay, which would then carry that away to the server. So can you maybe a bit discuss the relation to this? So in which sense this might be using stronger assumption, and in which sense the kind of guarantees that you would get at the end would be of the same order, or I'm trying to understand how this would position maybe with respect to something like this, which assumes there is a secure shuffler, which is a strong assumption to some extent. But.
Yes, I mean, I think you could use a secure shuffler in our variant 2, right? In the variant 1, it's, I mean, like you probably wouldn't want a shuffler. What you would want is like that the shuffler keeps this list of people who have checked in, and the server says, send me an update, and doesn't know who this update is coming from. You could potentially get a bit more privacy out of this, but it's a bit tricky because the privacy of shuffling depends on how many people you're shuffling with. And that would mean that you need to control the size of like how many people checked in each time slot.
Right.
And like in steps where there's only one person, this person would not get amplification. So you would be getting I think like we're talking about getting guarantees against the server being malicious, and to do those, maybe you would need to enforce some sort of coordination as opposed to just like people picking the slot on their own. You might want to do something that is like, okay, I can probably like try to shuffle everyone and then like take chunks. So I make sure that at each time step, like there's a number, like there's a fixed number of people contributing to each update. And then you could apply this sort of guarantees. It feels like, from my limited understanding of like how these things are really implemented in practice, it feels really tricky to get something scalable. And also like okay, so if you don't trust the server, like where are you going to get like a trusted shuffler from, and so on. But I agree. But I don't want to rule this out. I think that there might be some like clever tricks out there that one can use to do interesting things.
Yeah, or you might need to model this. Okay, here the nice thing also is that indeed you model the availability. I mean, you have worst case. Essentially, you don't assume anything about how clients become available or not in the first place.
Yeah, that was one of the starting requirements for this work, actually. Like, let's try to do something that doesn't assume anything in terms of how nature picks who's available and who's not.
Cool, thanks. We have a question from Balle.
So there is two more questions, actually. There's also a question from Igor. So let me just unmute him, and then we can ask from Mari.
Hi, thanks for your talk. You mentioned in some of your assumptions that the users are kind of, they're not adversaries, and they, all of them kind of flip a coin and a dice to participate in this check-in. Do you get it right that this kind of analysis doesn't work when we have some kind of adversarial devices? And do you have any intuition or just your thoughts how whether it will work for such cases if the devices know the protocol and try to somehow abuse it?
Yes. I mean, like here, devices could do all sorts of things. So it's a bit tricky to like narrow down what they might or might not want to do and what they can do. So they can do a lot of nasty stuff to compromise utility of the model, perhaps. And this would be kind of related to like data poisoning and so on. So that's a completely different story. In terms of the privacy, basically, like I made this assumption that they're honest but curious. So it is like necessary for variant 2. For variant 1, I think you can relax this a little bit and basically, yeah. So this assumption is not really needed for variant 1. I think it's just needed for variant 2.
Okay, thank you.
Then we have another question from Marie. Let me unmute you.
Hi. So sorry if you already specified this point. I have some connection problem during your talk. But first, thank you for this talk. And so my question is, does the server know from which node each local solution come from?
Yes. Yeah, the server knows, because the server is the one that looks at the list of checked-in clients and pinging the client that the server chooses to provide the update. I think this is related to Aurelian's question of whether, so the privacy guarantees that people get if the server is compromised are not very strong in these kind of protocols. And Aurelian, I think, was proposing like some methods that would use some intermediate trusted shuffler or something like this that would provide some anonymity between what the server sees and who the updates are coming from. So if this setup or this kind of threat vector is something that, I don't know, is reasonable for applications, then I think one should consider slightly different protocols.
Okay, thank you.